The junior senator from Virginia.
Might I inquire if we're in a quorum call?
We are not.
Madam President, I rise today certain that by now some of the desk staff have memorized the speech I'm about to give, because it's the third time that I will have given it in the last few weeks on a topic that is really important to Virginia, the FAA Reauthorization bill that's now pending before the body. I want to thank Chairwoman Cantwell, Ranking Member Cruz, and the members of the Commerce Committee, because as a general matter, this is a necessary bill with a lot of good provisions in it. In particular, the work on air traffic control recruitment and training and pilot training hours. I feel very, very good about that work that's been done. But the gist of this bill is to promote air safety. And there is one provision in the bill that is dramatically contrary to the thrust of this bill. It will not increase air safety, it will reduce air safety, and it will reduce air safety in the capital of the United States at Reagan National Airport, otherwise known as DCA. I'm going to summarize quickly the arguments that I've made the last couple of weeks, but then I want to respond to at least three questions that folks who take a position opposite to me have raised, and use some data to demonstrate that those questions, though honestly raised, have answers, and the answers actually verify and uphold the position that my Maryland and Virginia colleagues take, that we should not be jamming more flights onto the busiest runway in the United States. Reagan National Airport, DCA, built a long time ago. It's a postage stamp. It's 860 acres. By order of comparison, Dulles Airport is about 12,000 acres. Dallas-Fort Worth is about 19,000 acres. Denver's 32,000 acres. When Reagan National was built, it was a little bit the trend to build these smaller airports near downtowns because the airplanes were smaller and they were props with fewer passengers, and they were lighter, and they didn't need as much landing runway space to take off or land. When Reagan National was built on this 860 acres, and if you've been there, you know that it's 860 that can't be expanded because it's surrounded on three sides by water, and on the other side by not by US 1, by the George Washington Parkway. There's no way to expand this. It was built with three runways, a primary runway and two commuter runways, and the estimate was in the 1960s that Reagan National, with these three runways, could accommodate 15 million passengers a year. 15 million passengers a year. Well, where are we today, circa 2024? Reagan National is now 25.5 million passengers a year. 25.5 million passengers, an additional 2/3 over what it was built for on a landlocked footprint with three runways. There's been a couple of other important changes at Reagan National. The idea was to spread the 15 million passengers over three runways, but that was when the planes were smaller and they were props. Now they're jets, and they can't land on the shorter runways. So today at Reagan National, 90% of the traffic into Reagan National has to use the main runway. So think about this. If it was 15 million equally divided, then each runway would bring in about 5 million passengers a year. Now, the main runway doesn't have 5 million. It has 22.5 million passengers a year, with only about 2.5 to 3 million on the other two runways. There's been another major change since this projection of 15 million a year was made, and that is 9/11. And in the aftermath of 9/11, we imposed dramatically more stringent security requirements on the air patterns over Reagan National, make it much harder to get into a landing zone to land or to take off. So what does that mean? Built for 15.5 million on a landlocked spot, now at 25 million, what does it mean? Well, it means that the main runway at Reagan National is now the single busiest runway in the United States. Reagan National, because it's small, it's not the busiest airport in the United States. It's only 19th in terms of the total passengers in and out. But that main runway, with 90% of the traffic, is the busiest runway in the United States. And what does that mean? What does it mean to have one primary runway with 90% of the traffic that's the busiest in the United States? Well, it's pretty easy to predict. It means very significant congestion. So let me give you some stats about that. Reagan, as the 19th busiest airport in the United States, has the 8th most daily delay. You calculate daily delay by the percentages of incoming and outgoing that are delayed, multiplied by the average delay. More than 20% of flights into and out of Reagan National are delayed. They're not delayed by a little. There are some airports that have worse on-time records, but the delay is a little bit of delay. The average delay of flights in and out of Reagan National, once delayed, is 67 minutes already. That accounts to over 11,000 minutes of delay every day. And what does delay mean? Delay means, okay, you're late arriving or you're late taking off. But because if you're taking off, you might be trying to make a connecting flight, it also means you take off late, you're likely to miss your connecting flight. Or if you're coming in late and the plane is supposed to leave to take some people out and go somewhere else, the delay cascades down and it affects the entire system. Delay isn't the only measure of this airport's congestion. A second one is the number of canceled flights. Now, some airports have cancellations. I mean, maybe Madison, the weather's not so great, or Anchorage, or the Windy City, or Minneapolis. DCA has the third worst cancellation rate among these airports. And it's not because of weather. The weather here in DC may not be great, but it's not catastrophic either. The delay is a function of congestion. Here's another measure. Planes that are landing, that upon landing have to get rerouted into a looping pattern. DCA is the third worst in that. Well, what does that matter? Well, first, it creates delay, but second, if you're looping planes through a constricted airspace as planes are taking off and landing every minute, you are increasing the risk of accident. So by all these measures, delay, average daily delay, cancellations, looping patterns, this airport, built for $15 million, now at $25 million, has serious problems already before you add any more flights to it. The problems are more than just delay. The problems are also safety. I mean, we're all experienced folks, and we know on roads, the more congested the road, the more likely an accident. Roads that are lightly traveled, less likely to have accident. Roads that are more heavily traveled, more likely to have accidents. I've talked about this before. I had a chance to play the air traffic control tape for colleagues of mine. I can't do that on the floor of the Senate. But about 2 weeks ago, there was a plane maneuvering on the main runway to take off and another plane trying to maneuver to one of the smaller runways to take off, and they almost collided. The frantic voice of the air traffic controller could be heard shouting, "Stop, stop," and these planes ended up stopping within 300 feet of each other, inside 100 yards of each other at this super busy airport. Thank God a collision and a catastrophe was averted, but more and more planes on this busiest runway in the United States is just going to increase the chance of a significant incident. Don't take my word for it. Even though, senators, I know we like to think we're experts about everything, there are experts in this. The Federal Aviation Administration and the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority. What does the FAA say about this? They point out all the statistics that I've just given you come from the FAA. There is a Senate proposal before us that would add 10 flights into Reagan National. That's called 5 slots. Each slot is a flight in and a flight out, a total of 10 more flights a day. What does the FAA say about it? They've given the committee and they've given the senators from the region the same set of data, and what they say is you can't even add 1 flight in without increasing delay, which is already significant. But if you add 10, 5 slots, the delay will increase by 751 minutes a day. There's already more than 11,000 minutes of delay a day. If you take the flights that are delayed and you multiply it by the minutes that they are delayed, adding 5 slots, 10 flights will add to that 751 additional minutes of delay, 751 minutes that make people late, that jeopardize their ability to get a connection, that cause cascading delay in the other airports, which are going to maybe be the recipients of planes taking off late from Reagan National. That's what the FAA, charged with the safe and efficient operation of American airspace is telling the United States Senate. Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority. Congress created it in the late 1980s. Congress appoints its board and charges it with the operation not only of Reagan National, but also the Dulles Airport. What does the MWA say? MWA says, stop, stop. Don't add any more flights because the delay is already unacceptable. And if you jam more flights onto the busiest runway in the United States, you raise the safety risk. Now, again, we senators like to think we know a lot. We don't know as much about efficient and safe air traffic operations as the Federal Aviation Administration. We don't know as much as the Metropolitan Washington Airports Administration. So when the delay statistics already point out that this is unacceptable, when the cancellation and looping into loop statistics are dangerous, when we've had a near collision that's a flashing red warning signal right in our face before this vote, when the FAA is saying you can't even put one flight in without increasing what is already unacceptable delay, and when the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority that we created and that we appoint their board says don't do this, why would we do this? Why would we do this? The senators from the region who have the most at stake stand uniform. Senators Cardin, Van Hollen, Warner, and I opposed to the slot increase that is in the Senate bill that's pending before us. And we have an amendment that would strip those 5 slots, 10 flights out so that we don't make this worse. Since I last appeared on the floor to talk about this last week, colleagues have come up to me with some questions, and they've raised 3. Here's one. DCA is under capacity because DCA was approved for more than 1,000 flights a day in the 1960s, and there's only 890 flights in and out today. So therefore, there must be more capacity at DCA. Those who ask that question are stating a truth. DCA was approved for over 1,000 flights a day in the 1960s, when most of the flights had props, not jets, when most of the craft were smaller and had fewer passengers and could take off and land on shorter runways. So yes, in the aviation world of the 1960s, DCA was approved for over 1,000 flights. But in the aviation world of 2024, where it's jets with more passengers that take more time to land and take off, that isn't that relevant. It's not that relevant. And in fact, another change that's happened that's important that I alluded to earlier is we were set up for 1,000 in and out, more than 1,000 in and out in the 1960s. Well, 9/11 happened since then. And after 9/11, thank God, we've imposed much more stringent criteria on air traffic over the D.C. region, the Capitol, the Pentagon, the White House, Congress, to make sure that there aren't challenges in the airspace that would lead to really serious harm and risk to people on planes and people who live in the area. And so the FAA has said, you're right, we did approve a higher capacity in the 1960s, but the changes in the number, size of planes has constricted them to the one runway, and changes in the airspace has made it harder. And that's why even though we're not at the capacity that was established in the 1960s, you can't even put one more flight into DCA without expanding delay. So that's the first argument. Yeah, the 1960s was different. 2024 is a completely different kettle of fish. You shouldn't be jamming flights onto this runway. The second thing I've heard said is, well, DCA actually has pretty good on-time percentage. Not bad delay, good on-time percentage. And it is true if you just look at the percentage of planes that land or take off on time. DCA is better than some airports. Now, it's kind of sad to say that 20+ % of our flights are delayed in and out, and that's better than some others. But here's what you got to know. Which airport would you feel more, comfortable flying into? One with a 80% on-time record, but where the average delay in that 20% was 67%? Or what if you flew into one with a worse on-time record, but where the average delay was 10 minutes? 67 minutes is a hassle. 67 minutes means a misconnection. 67 minutes means cascading delay throughout the system. 3 minutes or 10 minutes doesn't. And so just looking at on-time percentage doesn't give you the full picture of this airport. And that's why the FAA measures delay, not in on-time percentage, but in total daily delay. And based on that measure, DCA is not a high performer. It's already a poor performer. We shouldn't add to it. The last thing I'll say, and then, Madam President, I'll yield to other colleagues who wish to speak, is some have said, oh, this is just a fight between some airlines. You know, United likes it one way, Delta likes it another way, maybe some other airlines aren't expressing their position. Who cares about them? Who cares about the airlines? We ought to care about safety. We ought to care about passengers. We ought to care about the 25.5 million people that are using this DCA airport on an annual basis. And we ought to weigh that 25.5 million a lot heavier than a couple of dozen people in the Senate who would like to have more convenience on flights into DCA. And this is ultimately about the Senate, because as I have said to my colleagues, the House took up the same issue in the FAA reauthorization bill. And in the committee, they chose not to jam more flights into DCA. And then when the bill was on the floor, someone tried to make the amendment that's the same amendment that's before us today. Hey, why not add 5 slots, 10 flights? And the House rejected it. So this is not a battle with the House. The House has accepted the advocacy of the FAA and EMWA and the regional delegation. They've paid heed to the potential impacts on delay and cancellations and even potential collisions. And they've said, we're not going to run this risk. The last thing we want is for there to be something bad happen out at that airport and people stick a mic in our face and say, hey, you knew all this and you were warned, but you voted for it anyway? And so the House rejected this. And what Senator Warner and I and Senator Van Hollen and Cardin, the 4 senators from the region affected by this bill, affected very dramatically by the bill, are asking is, we hope our Senate colleagues will too. We want to support this FAA bill. It's got a lot of good in it. But when it comes to jamming more flights onto the busiest runway in the United States, we're saying exactly what this air traffic controller said, narrowly averting a collision. Stop. Stop, for God's sake, stop. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.